Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 47, Allies and Enemies. When we last left the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc had appeared out of nowhere, well, really out of Domremy, and led the forces of Charles VII to a series of victories culminating in the king's coronation at Reims. The resurgence that Joan sparked will keep going over the next few years, as the French continue their advance and begin to poke holes in the English lines. But the English are still in the fight, and the 100 Years' War still has a few decades to go. Now, you might remember my defense of the terms Dauphinist and Lancastrian, as opposed to English and French a number of episodes back. My philosophy at that point was to emphasize the continuity of the current phase of the 100 Years' War with the Civil War, and the support in France that the Lancastrians were able to curry. Now that Charles VII has been crowned, I've realized that I can no longer reasonably cling to the term Dauphinist. I've considered replacing it with Valois in order to emphasize the dynastic conflict as opposed to the national conflict, but as I've done more research on the later years of the war, I've come to the conclusion that the Lancastrian regime is becoming steadily more English. I will still use Lancastrian and Valois on occasion, but I don't think that it is quite as anachronistic to simply call the Lancastrian regime English and the Valois regime French as it once was. We'll explore this trend in this and in the coming episodes, and one example, right off the bat, is the coronation of Henry VI of England. Wait, no, Henry II of France. Henry's coronation had been brought up here and there over the years, but the king was still young, and there wasn't much of a reason to rush it. However, after the French resurgence began, the Duke of Bedford began pushing for it more, thinking that he could appropriate the legitimacy which Charles VII had gained in 1429. The 8-year-old King of England and, allegedly, France, landed in Calais in the spring of 1430. He arrived with an army of almost 5,000 men, and the plan was to launch a major offensive to reverse the recent French gains, and lead the young king to Reims for a proper coronation. But, as it was, the French garrisons in Champagne could not be easily dislodged, as Philip the Good learned at Compiègne. Well, in my episodes on Joan of Arc, I presented Philip as the one pushing for the siege of Compiègne. That was not quite the case. The Duke of Burgundy wanted to regain the city, sure, and its French allegiance was a pressure point in the truce between Philip and Charles. But the Duke did not necessarily think that a siege was the right move. Philip advocated a strategy of moving against the smaller garrisons in the region, to isolate the major fortresses, such as Compiègne. The English, on the other hand, thought that Compiègne had to fall before any other major advance could occur. And, as the English were funding the lion's share of the Burgundian army at this point, the Duke of Burgundy demurred. But, consequently, when the siege of Compiègne failed, it became yet another point of friction between the allies. So, as the path to Reims could not be cleared, it was decided that Paris would be the site of Henry's coronation. This was not without precedent, as a handful of French kings had been crowned elsewhere, but Paris certainly did not hold the same gravitas as Reims did. Even so, the route from Calais to Paris was also obstructed by French garrisons. Over the course of the next year and a half, these were cleared, albeit with much difficulty, and some only temporarily. But finally, in December 1431, Henry was crowned King of France. Much to the chagrin of the Bishop of Paris, the now 10-year-old was crowned by his great-uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, as the French cleric had to sit on the sidelines in his own cathedral. In addition to being crowned by an English prelate as opposed to a French one, several other things emphasized the Englishness of the whole affair. First of all, only 2 of the 12 traditional peers of France were present at the ceremony, the Bishop of Beauvais, a certain Pierre Cauchon, and the Bishop of Noyon. Philip the Good, the first peer of the realm, and the most important French ally of the Lancastrian regime, was busy in talks with Charles VII at the time. No, the Anglo-Burgundian alliance is as strong as ever. Why do you ask? Furthermore, the lack of French peers was not made up for elsewhere, as most of the other officers of state who took part in the ceremony were Englishmen, and the mass accompanying the coronation was sung by English choristers in the English style. And not only was the coronation too English, but it was also just plain disappointing to the people it was supposed to appeal to. In the feast following the ceremony, the food served to the attendees had been cooked days ago, and reportedly was so bad that even the sick and poor who were there to receive alms refused it. A standard that English cuisine has been striving for ever since. What's more, the grants which traditionally followed such a ceremony were omitted. Usually, upon the crowning of a new king, prisoners were pardoned, favors were doled out, and debts were forgiven. But not now. Most upsetting here was the lack of a tax amnesty. But, put simply, the government could not afford it, as the long war against Charles VII was draining royal funds faster than they were accumulating. A few months after the coronation, Henry returned to England. In the end, the fleeting presence of the king and the disappointing coronation did little to rally the people of Lancastrian France. And the biggest consequence of the whole affair was that now the prospect of yielding the crown to Charles in some sort of settlement was out of the question entirely. As for the army which accompanied the young king to France, most of the soldiers' terms of service had expired by now, and a new army would have to be raised if offensive actions were to continue. This situation is emblematic of the period. The English have managed, and can still manage, impressive bursts of fundraising and recruiting for their expeditionary armies, but they were unable to maintain those armies long term. This dynamic wasn't necessarily bad when the English were on the rise. The expeditionary armies could lead the advance, while forces raised and paid for locally could garrison the insulated territories of Lancastrian France. But with the strategic situation beginning to shift, the present English military posture proved vulnerable on the defensive. As the French retook more land and fortresses, the English campaigns in response got longer and required more sieges. In these more drawn-out campaigns, there was the risk that before any meaningful gains could be made, the soldiers' terms of service might expire, or the commanders might run out of money to pay their soldiers. And this problem only worsened as the stress of raising men and money was increasingly being borne by England alone. Since the Treaty of Troyes, the armies of Lancastrian France had always had some sort of native component, and tax revenue from the occupied territories made a significant contribution towards paying those armies. And while this contribution wasn't a majority, every soldier and every penny counted. But with many of the English conquests of the past few years under threat or reversed, only the city of Paris and the Duchy of Normandy now meaningfully contributed taxes to the coffers of Lancastrian France. But even Normandy and Paris were not insulated from French raids, as they had once been, and their tax revenues were falling. They could still afford to pay for their own defense, but they could not pay for the defense of the rest of the occupied territories. And as the setbacks continued, the French in Lancastrian France grew disenchanted with the English, while the English in Lancastrian France grew distrustful of the French. What had once been an admittedly foreign-dominated but locally accepted government now began to turn into a government of occupation. In years past, the Duke of Bedford had gone to great lengths to portray his administration as French, and to employ French officers both in the court and in the army. But now, the administration of Lancastrian France was increasingly filled with Englishmen, and the summons of the local nobility for military service became an increasingly rare affair. The This is not to say that the Lancastrian regime was actively excluding French people who wanted to aid them, as can be seen in the ever more prominent role that John of Luxembourg and his brothers were playing. But this is a trend that begins around this time, and will continue to grow. Furthermore, I don't want to suggest that the English were about to be totally pushed out of France. Bedford and the rest of the military leaders in Lancastrian France were aware of their weaknesses, and over the next few years will work to shore up their military posture. The English will still have their share of military victories in France, but momentum is now with Charles VII, and that share is shrinking. As the English were scrambling to various degrees to stabilize the situation in northern France, their Burgundian allies were faced with troubles of their own. I mentioned back in episode 42 that after the siege of Compiègne was lifted, the French forces began a counterattack into Picardy. So let's begin there. In the wake of the withdrawal from Compiègne, the English contingent at the siege mutinied and retreated to Normandy due to the fact that they had not been paid in 2 months. The departure of the English left the remaining Burgundian forces in the region outmatched, and to say that Philip was outraged would be putting it gently. He had advised against the siege of Compiègne in the first place. He had to deal with persistent late payments from the English, and now he was exposed due to his allies' inability to pay their own soldiers. The English rushed to send more soldiers to assist the Burgundian forces in their defense of Picardy, but little aid ended up materializing, and many of the companies sent over were intercepted on the way. As the French counterattack really began, things on the Anglo-Burgundian side were disorganized and confused. Several towns and fortresses fell to the advancing French, and Philip the Good, still in Brabant working to establish his hold on the duchy, had to return to Picardy to stem the tide of the French advance. While the Duke's return to the Somme did stabilize the situation, late 1430 and early 1431 was a tough time for the Burgundian domains. Even after the Burgundian position steadied, warfare in the region was now endemic, and the Duke of Burgundy needed to station more men along the Somme to prevent another major incursion. The disastrous Battle of Antoine, which we covered in the last episode, had occurred a few months earlier, and the war between Namur and Liège, which we covered in the episode before that, was ongoing as well. And that was only the half of it. It seemed that on all fronts, the Duke of Burgundy was exposed. The conflicts in the Dauphiné and Namur were, all things considered, relatively minor affairs, and what was really frightening Philip the Good was the fact that his lands were being deliberately targeted by French belligerents for the first time since the early 1420s. Ironically, it was only after Joan of Arc was captured that the court of Charles VII began to reevaluate their policy of appeasement with the Duke of Burgundy, and began to pursue the policy of aggression that the Maid had advocated for. The old Armagnac captain, Arnaud-Guilhem de Barbazan, had recently been released from captivity, and had set himself up in French Champagne, where he launched repeated attacks into Burgundian Champagne. Barbazan was a skilled and aggressive military commander, and he soon began taking several important towns, forts, and bridges in the region. The Marshal of Burgundy, Antoine de Toulongeon, led a Burgundian force into Champagne to relieve one of these towns, but he was defeated in battle by Barbazan, who had just been reinforced by René of Anjou, and was forced to withdraw back to Burgundy. After seeing off the Marshal of Burgundy, Arnaud-Guilhem de Barbazan and René of Anjou had basically free reign in Champagne, and they worked to dismantle the defenses between Burgundy and Champagne, and began raiding into the home duchy. Burgundy, which had once been so nicely insulated by truces and alliances, was now exposed on multiple fronts. In addition to Barbazan's raids from Champagne, the court of Charles VII cried havoc and let slip the dogs of war when they commissioned several mostly independent mercenary captains to set themselves up around the county of Tonnerre and the Auxerrois. From the south, the Count of Clermont led the charge against Burgundy by launching attacks into the county of Charolais and the Mâconnais. Clermont had spent much of the past year in the north, where he had been stationed after the French army withdrew from Paris in 1429, but he had recently been reassigned. The transfer was a natural choice, as the Count of Clermont was, well, the Count of Clermont, i.e. the oldest son and heir of the Duke of Bourbon. Many of the lands controlled by the House of Bourbon, the Duchy of Bourbon itself, along with the County of Forêt and the Lordship of Beaujeu, sat due south of the Duchy of Burgundy, and the relationship between the neighboring dukes of Bourbon and Burgundy has gone through some ups and downs. As a brief refresher, John, Duke of Bourbon, was a committed Armagnac, but after a few years of civil war, John of Bourbon and John the Fearless realized that it was best to keep the conflict away from their own lands, and throughout the 1410s, a series of local truces insulated Burgundy and the Bourbonnais from violence, even as the dukes opposed each other on the national stage. In 1415, John of Bourbon was captured at the Battle of Agincourt, and 15 years later, he's still in English captivity, so the administration of the House of Bourbon's lands was left to the Duchess of Bourbon and the Count of Clermont. At that point, the relationship between Bourbon and Burgundy warmed a bit, as the truces were expanded, and in 1425, the Count of Clermont married Philip's sister Agnes. But despite the generally good relationship between the princes, Clermont was committed to the Valois cause, and saw in Burgundy an opportunity to expand his family's lands. So when he was told to take over the war on the Burgundian March, he did so without a second thought. Over the next few years, the southern flank of the Duchy of Burgundy, along with the county of Charolais and the Mâconnais, was under near constant threat, and parts of Charolais and Mâcon were even occupied by Clermont's forces as he tried to annex the territories. With raids and invasion coming from the north, northwest, and south, all hands were on deck in the Duchy of Burgundy. Antoine de Toulongeon, the Marshal of Burgundy, and Nicolas Roland, the Chancellor of Burgundy, took the lead in defending the home duchy, as Philip was still occupied in his northern territories. With the Burgundian state under attack from so many different directions, Philip was forced to field a number of large armies on various fronts throughout his domains, and the cost of these armies was becoming prohibitive. And in 1431, another front opened up, when Charles of Lorraine died, and René of Anjou became the new Duke of Lorraine. In our last episode, we saw how René immediately began a conflict with Antoine de Vaudemont, a nephew of the old Duke of Lorraine and a Burgundian ally. Vaudemont knew that he could not stand up to the new Duke of Lorraine all on his own, and so appealed to the Duke of Burgundy for support. Philip was inclined to help Antoine de Vaudemont out, but to do so he would need to divert soldiers from another front, and none of his commanders wanted to give up any of their men. As the debate on what to do raged in the Burgundian court, Antoine de Toulongeon emerged as the champion of the expedition to Lorraine. He argued that if René of Anjou was allowed to establish himself in the duchy, the two Burgundies would be under a greater threat than ever before. Philip agreed, and, much to the annoyance of his northern commanders, the Duke transferred about 1,500 men from Picardy to Burgundy to support Toulongeon and Vaudemont. While the Somme front was weakened by this decision, it paid off, as we saw in the last episode. The Battle of Boulneville did not totally reverse the strategic situation, but it did stabilize things, and allowed the Burgundian forces to get some much-needed breathing room. One major factor in this was the death of Arnaud-Guilhem de Barbazan. While there were plenty of other French commanders still making trouble for the Duke of Burgundy and Champagne, none of them were as talented or as antagonistic as Barbazan was, and most of them were really just opportunistic mercenaries rather than trusted commanders who were truly integrated into the French command structure. Moreover, the capture of René of Anjou removed the threat of another invasion from Lorraine, and gave Philip the Good a useful bargaining chip. But, even with the breathing room which Bourneville gave Philip, he was still in an unsustainable position, and he needed to either secure more aid from his allies or re-establish his truce with his enemies. So, towards the end of 1431, the Duke sent out embassies to both the English and French courts. To the English, he complained about the monetary and manpower cost of defending his territories. The Duke of Burgundy demanded that the English send reinforcements to Burgundy at their expense, and if they could not do so, he would be forced to enter into a new truce with the French. The English had little men and money to spare themselves, and so while they did tell John of Luxembourg to help out with the defense of Burgundy and Picardy, they could do little else. Philip the Good was coming to the conclusion that his allies were no longer able to win the war, and as their position grew weaker, he became more exposed. Had he chosen the wrong side back in 1420? Richard Vaughan writes that in this period, quote, Philip's attitude towards the English had changed from indifference or disillusion to outright discontent. And of course, Philip was already in negotiations to reinstate his truce with the French, and these would go better than his talks with the English. Representing Burgundy here was the Chamberlain of Burgundy and Knight of the Golden Fleece, Jean de la Tremoille, while representing France was Charles VII's favorite counselor and Jean's brother, Georges de la Tremoille. The La Tremoille brothers were able to arrange a 6-year truce, but that was worth more on paper than it was in fact. As it was, while Philip the Good and Charles VII agreed not to fight each other, they had limited ability to speak for their allies and underlings. The English were not involved with these negotiations and had no intention of stopping their military efforts, and if any Burgundian captains wanted to keep up the fight, they could simply claim that they were fighting on behalf of Henry VI rather than Philip the Good. On the other side, Charles VII employed a number of independent captains who were more mercenaries living off the land than French captains wholly loyal to the king. Therefore, when Charles said, "We don't need you anymore," their response was mostly along the lines of, "Cool, we're going to keep raiding in the area though." Additionally, while the Count of Clermont had begun his advance against Burgundy on the king's behalf, he had no intention of leaving his conquests half-finished, and kept up the fight in Charolais and Mâcon. So, with the fight being carried on by allies, irregulars, and free companies, the Truce of 1431 did not mark the end of Burgundian involvement in the 100 Years' War. And both Charles VII and Philip would move against each other on occasion over the next few years. That all being said, it did represent a reshuffling of Charles's military priorities, such that Burgundy was once again a distant second to the English. And while Philip was not through with his participation in the 100 Years' War, his future campaigns would be focused on clearing his lands and borders of hostile garrisons rather than any offensive against Charles. The half-hearted implementation of the 1431 deal convinced Philip more than ever that peace with France was necessary. Not a truce, but an actual peace. The cost of war, in men, in money, and in destruction, was mounting, and truces were only temporary patches of limited efficacy. And this can be seen clearly in 1432, when the Count of Clermont's attacks on the southern flank of Burgundy continued, along with the independent attacks on the northern flank. Now, while Philip the Good was anxious for peace and disenchanted with his English allies, the Anglo-Burgundian alliance wasn't necessarily dead yet. However, when Philip's sister Anne died in late 1432, the writing was on the wall. In addition to being Philip's sister, Anne of Burgundy was the Duke of Bedford's wife, and she was the main go-between for the regent of Lancastrian France and his most important French ally. Throughout the years, many disputes between Bedford and Burgundy had arisen, but Anne was always able to get her husband and brother back on the same page. But with Anne gone, it was up to ambassadors and courtiers to paper over the differences between the princes, and none of them were able to do so quite as effectively. John of Bedford would definitively tank his relationship with his former brother-in-law when he remarried just 6 months later. Philip objected to both the quickness with which Bedford moved on from his sister, as well as the choice of bride. John of Bedford's second wife was Jacquetta of Luxembourg, the daughter of Peter of Luxembourg, the Count of Saint-Pol and a Knight of the Golden Fleece. On the surface, it seems like a match between Bedford and the House of Luxembourg would be amenable to the Duke of Burgundy, as Peter, along with his brothers John and Louis, were some of Philip's most important vassals. But they were also some of his most powerful, and some of the most staunchly pro-English. At a time when Burgundy was beginning to pull away from England, this marriage had the potential to swing the House of Luxembourg to the English side if a breach opened up, and if the House of Luxembourg declared against him, Philip would have a hard time maintaining his hold on Picardy. By mid-1433, the relationship between John of Bedford and Philip the Good had deteriorated to the point where the two refused to even meet with each other. Cardinal Henry Beaufort had attempted to arrange a conference where the two men, who at one point really had been friends, could reconcile. But while both Bedford and Burgundy traveled to Saint-Omer where the conference was set to take place, neither man was willing to call on the other, and so they both left Saint-Omer without meeting. And in fact, they would never meet face to face again. Across the Channel, the long-suffering ducal councillor and Knight of the Golden Fleece, Hugh de Lannoy, was working to maintain the strained partnership between England and Burgundy. Lannoy was tasked with presenting Philip's demands to Parliament, as well as finding out the general attitude of the English both towards the war and towards Burgundy. And it shouldn't surprise you to hear that the English were tired of paying for the war and distrusted the Duke of Burgundy. In this tense atmosphere, Lannoy presented Parliament and the English Royal Council with two paths forward. One option was for the English to really commit to the war, vote more taxes, and raise more soldiers. The Duke of Burgundy was willing to stay in the war, but his allies would have to be willing to assure the defense of his lands and shoulder the cost of the fighting. The other option, the one that the Duke of Burgundy preferred at this point, was for the English to negotiate with the French to end the war diplomatically. It was the same choice which Philip had presented the English with in 1431. The Duke of Burgundy was still open to staying in the war, but if he was not properly supported by his allies, he would be forced to make peace. Both of the options presented were possible, but honestly, neither was particularly likely. The 100 Years' War had stretched the English crown's finances to the breaking point. By now, the only way that more money for the war could be raised was if Parliament agreed to a slate of new taxes, and Parliament really did not want to do that. And furthermore, these taxes would likely have to be renewed year after year if real progress was to be made. As for making peace, it was obvious that the French would only agree to a deal where Henry VI relinquished his claim to the French crown. Under Edward III and Richard II, the English claim to the French throne was really more of a legitimization and negotiation tool, and it was taken up and put down multiple times as circumstances required. But now that Henry had been crowned and consecrated, giving up the claim would be a matter of great dishonor rather than a bargaining chip. Moreover, as Henry VI was still a minor, his regents would be the ones giving up the crown for him, and that would be seen as a betrayal of the young king as well as of the legacy of Henry V and the memory of those who died in France. The French were unwilling to consider any peace deal where Henry VI would be recognized as king, and the English were unwilling to consider any peace deal where he wouldn't. However, the Duke of Burgundy cared far less for Henry's claim to the French throne, and was coming to terms with the idea of acknowledging his father's killer as the King of France. So even though the French and English were at loggerheads, The Duke of Burgundy was beginning to see peace as more desirable, and began to consider the English refusal to negotiate as yet another grievance. As much as he may have wanted to simply make peace and move on, Philip the Good had sworn a solemn oath not to make a separate peace when he signed the Treaty of Troyes, and so the Duke of Burgundy was bound to his allies. He did often threaten the English with the prospect of making a peace without them. In 1433 that was still just a threat, but one that was becoming more likely by the day. And yet, the Anglo-Burgundian alliance survived into 1433, and in the spring, another joint campaign into Champagne was launched. While the English had not committed men or money on the scale that the Duke of Burgundy had demanded, they were determined to carry on the fight, and Philip found it productive to continue his cooperation. The Duke of Burgundy gathered an army from Picardy and Artois, and began his offensive in his cousin's county of Rethel in northern Champagne. He was joined there by another cousin, John of Navarre, the brother of the Count of Rethel, and together the Burgundian princes marched south, further into Champagne, where they were joined by a force from Burgundy. As the Burgundian army marched through Champagne, another force, led by the Earl of Arundel and Sir John Talbot, marched into the region, joined by Knight of the Golden Fleece Jean de Villiers de l'Isle Adam, who gathered an army from Paris and the Ile-de-France, and the mercenary captain Perinet Grosart. Both Philip and Arundel's armies were around 3,000 strong, making the joint expedition one of the larger of the past few years. And even though momentum had been on the French side recently, things went quite well for the Allies. Their armies spread out and swept through the region. French garrisons were expelled, and French forces were defeated. After a few months, Arundel returned to Normandy to carry on the fight there, but the damage had been done. Champagne was not wholly returned to the Anglo-Burgundian side, but notably for the Duke of Burgundy, the parts of Champagne which bordered his lands were almost totally cleansed of their hostile garrisons. The success of this operation saved the Anglo-Burgundian alliance for another year, and in 1434, the Duke of Burgundy agreed to take part in another joint expedition. This time, the goal would be to remove the French from the Somme and Oise river valleys. John of Navarre was put in charge of the Burgundian force, while Talbot, Arundel, and Villiers de l'Isle Adam returned to fight alongside him. The English began the campaign around the Oise, while the Burgundians started off at the mouth of the Somme, and presumably the goal was to meet in the middle. Once again, things started out well for the Allies, and several French garrisons along the Oise were expelled by the English, while John of Navarre secured much of the lower Somme. However, this momentum was interrupted by the appearance of the Constable of France, Arthur de Richemont, who was once again in favor at the court of Charles VII after a turn of events which we'll cover next episode. Richemont did not face the English in battle, but his appearance prevented them from advancing any further into the Somme Valley, and when they withdrew, Richemont was able to focus his attentions on John of Navarre. Without his allies in the region, Navarre was outnumbered and outmatched. The Burgundian prince did his best to hold off Richemont, but the constable was able to capture the strategically important town of Aum and turned the planned Burgundian offensive operations into defensive operations. This abortive Somme campaign proved to be the last significant military effort of the Anglo-Burgundian alliance. Philip the Good, once again, asked his allies for more men and money to carry on the fight, but he was told that all available resources were already being used, a reply he likely expected to hear. The dual failure of the Somme campaign and his ambassador's efforts in England now thoroughly convinced Philip the Good that peace was the only way forward. He had been in on and off again negotiations with the French court over the past few years, and while they had not secured peace, it would be reductive to say that they were failures. Each time, the prospect of peace crept closer to reality, and next time, we'll trace the course of those negotiations and see where they go from here. Thank you so much to my patrons, with an extra thanks to my newest patron, John, Graaf van Helmont, and to Christine, Duchess de Nemours, Elliot, Graaf van Gravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graaf van Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Seymour, David, Graaf van Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quentin, Graaf van Blasveld, Tyler, Comte de Chamaret, Ian, Graaf van Arenberg, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graaf van Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review in your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at ValoisBurgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.